Alex, you can go ahead and start.
Well, should I start, or who else? Who's going to? Should I introduce myself, or should Michael introduce me, or what do you think? Or Michael's not here anymore. I don't see him. Well, should I just go ahead and introduce myself?
I don't think that would be too bad.
Okay. All right. Well, why don't we get started, everybody? People are still slowly filing in. So I'm Alex Wendt, and I'm presenting a paper on quantum theory as critical theory. I have some introductory remarks, but I guess the structure of this session is going to be, I'm going to just talk for 15 minutes about the paper. Well, actually, I got to back up. I'm all screwed up now because I wasn't expecting to introduce myself. So I'm going to back up and start over. Okay. So let me start my PowerPoint. The story of this paper. It is over 3 years old since the first draft was written. The paper has been twice rejected by journals. Although in fairness, 5 of the 6 reviewers were clearly not quantum people. So it was being reviewed extra paradigmatically. But nonetheless, the paper obviously has issues and problems. And the main comment, the main kind of barrier that I'm struggling with and getting over with reviewers is a motivational problem, which is, and I think this is actually a general problem for all quantum social science. So it's not just my paper, although I'm illustrating this. And the motivational problem is, over and over again, I hear, we've already got this covered. We don't need this. This is redundant. Either we're feminist theorists, relational theorists, post-structuralists, new materialists, even positivists. They're all saying, we don't need this. This is all redundant. It doesn't add anything. And actually, one reviewer summed up my paper by saying this paper should be rejected because it, quote, had no value added at all. So that was harsh, I thought. But anyway, that's sort of gives you a sense of the barrier. So obviously, the paper needs to be rewritten. And over 100 people signed up for this panel. And I decided that I didn't feel comfortable distributing a flawed paper to over 100 people if I was planning to rewrite the paper soon anyway. But I do hope to get some useful feedback from all of you in the audience. But in the meantime, it's kind of a roast the host is sort of the purpose here, I guess. But in the meantime, I brought on board 3 discussants, as I mentioned the first day: Morgan Liu of Ohio State Anthropology, Ben McKean, my colleague in political science, and Michael Murphy, a postdoc at Queen's University, who's a quantum IR guy. And so what I decided to do is, instead of presenting my paper, this flawed, long paper, I'm not going to present the paper itself. What I'm going to do is try to boil down the basic idea into a 15-minute presentation. And so that presentation only has a loose connection to the details of the paper. And it will have only a loose connection to the discussants' comments, all of whom who read the long paper and have comments on the long paper. So it's not an ideal match. On the other hand, this will be much more useful for me. And also, what's the point of presenting a deeply flawed paper? So in a sense, my talk is the first draft of the new version of the paper, which I'm hoping to fold all of your comments and the discussants' comments into. So, okay, so that's my kind of story of the paper. Should I just keep going, Kelly, or do you think, or?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So setting the stage. And so the complaint, well, the resistance, I've spent a lot of time thinking about, there's a lot of resistance to quantum ideas from places that I wouldn't have expected. And part of the rub or the difficulty is for my version of all this stuff is my claim in the paper and elsewhere that human beings really are quantum beings, really are walking quantum computers, basically, in some non-trivial sense of the word quantum there. And we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. But the intuition, I think, is fairly simple. And this realist assumption that people really are this way it just causes huge problems because it's very controversial, it's very speculative. And it also means that readers need to buy in much more, in a sense, in order to get with the argument. They have to buy into this assumption, perhaps, about people really being this way in order to accept the argument. And so I've made it very difficult for a lot of readers, in a sense, to kind of move along with me. So, and in fact, most quantum social science, as we've seen, is not realist at all. It's very much in a pragmatist spirit. We have quantum-like, we have quantum metaphors, we have as-if quantum. Not many people want to say that human beings really are quantum, because that gets us into quantum consciousness theory and a lot of very controversial ideas. So in general, the as-if metaphor quantum-like strategy, I think, is a very good strategy. It lowers the bar, lowers the cost of entry for readers. And so I'm not criticizing that approach. I think that approach, if you don't have to assume that people really are human, really are quantum, don't assume it. It's just going to cause problems for yourself. But there is a cost to that strategy of sort of avoiding this realist claim. And the cost is that you can't really say anything about what human beings are really like. You can't say anything about what is the fact of the matter, about what are human beings really quantum, or if they're not really quantum, are they really classical or not? And so it's almost as if the question of what our brains are like doesn't even matter to quantum social science. And that strikes me as very counterintuitive. And surely it does matter, at least in two ways. First, if our brains truly are classical, as is the orthodox view, then all the findings of quantum cognition and quantum decision theory are a gigantic surprise. Classical brains should not be producing quantum behavior systematically. So that's unusual if you assume that people really have classical brains. Okay, so why do you get quantum behavior from classical bodies, basically? Similarly, the question of whether we really are or not classical quantum matters because there was a train coming. Okay, sorry. It really matters because if we really are quantum beings have a much greater potential for cooperation, for creativity, all kinds of things, much more potential than their primitive classical cousins, at least if these quantum beings are aware of their powers and so on. So in a sense, my idea here is that the question of whether people are really quantum or not opens the door to a critical theory in the old-fashioned sense. And by that, I mean a social or political theory that has emancipatory potential by virtue of its ability to diagnose false consciousness. So false consciousness is a key part of the argument I'm going to end up making today. And that false consciousness, of course, implies that there is some more genuine or true consciousness that could be had if only we could take the blinders off, if we embrace a quantum perspective and so on. So in my view, a critical theory has to have a realist moment. It doesn't mean it has to be completely realist, but it has to have a realist moment to really get leverage on something, as opposed to saying, well, we don't really know. Okay. So there are lots of ways to illustrate, I think, the value added of a quantum perspective in social science. I'm just going to focus on one concept, entanglement, because that's especially relevant for any kind of macro social science, like political science or sociology. And I understand entanglement in the straightforward way. It's a holistic, relational, non-causal connection between quantum systems, in this case, between human beings, such that a single wave function in principle will be necessary to describe both or everybody. And entanglement is also the basis of so-called non-local causation or spooky action at a distance, although there's nothing really causal about it, because one of the important implications of entangled systems is that they're not fully separable. And if you're not fully separable, you can't have a traditional causal connection in the efficient causation sense. So in physics, of course, entanglement is very mysterious because all these non-local effects are very hard to understand in a physical context. And so much ink has been spilled on trying to understand entanglement in the physical domain. But in social science, entanglement seems ubiquitous and banal, almost banal, in the sense that everything in our lives is relational. Everything in our lives is entangled through language. And then if you think about all the roles we play, husband, wife, citizen, alien, master, slave, soldier, officer, all these different roles that we play, you can't be one without the other. There's always some kind of relationality built into human beings in general. And this is something I believed a long time. It was in my first book too, but it wasn't quantized then. But in a way, one way to summarize this is that meaning is inherently holistic. And that's an argument I made back in my 99 book. So another famous example is the Socrates and Xantippe example, right? Socrates commits suicide, he's forced to, and Xantippe instantly becomes a widow, even though she's far away. So that's not and this is a philosophical problem that people have looked at. And the conclusion, as far as I can tell, is that this is not a traditional causal relationship between Socrates' death and Xantippe becoming a widow. So that to me is a sort of an intuitive example, I think, of a quantum thing. So the rest of the talk, what I'm going to do is play a what if game. I'm going to say, what if? This is not as if, it's really what if human beings really are quantum. Okay, so you have to give me that premise. Maybe that premise is wrong, in which case the whole argument is moot. Okay, but if I have that premise, that's what the rest of the argument assumes. And what I want to do is give you two examples. There's one quick example of this idea, but then there's really the second example is the punchline of the paper. So I want to get to that as quickly as I can. Okay. So the first example that I want to talk about is structural violence and injustice. And I should point out that although I've been interested in this for a long time, Michael Murphy, one of the discussants, has actually published an article on this just, a year or two ago. And so I would urge you to direct your questions to him rather than to me, although I'll do the best I can to answer them. But Michael might want to send a citation around through the chat function if you're interested. So anyway, the idea of structural violence, you've all heard of systemic racism and critical race theory because of Ron DeSantis and the Republican primaries and so on. Structural violence is kind of what underlies those kinds of arguments. And as I understand structural violence, it's a kind of violence that is not reducible to the kinetic violence of individuals upon each other. It's often discursive and it's often non-local. At least that's the implicit claim, although that word is not necessarily always used. But certainly the idea of structural violence figures very prominently in contemporary politics, both on the left, which believes in it, and on the right, which I would say probably does not believe in it. Okay. And the intuition of those on the left is that the presence of structural violence leads to injustices, epistemic injustice, economic, intergenerational, various kinds of injustices. And then public policy's job is to fix those injustices. So it has an implication. If you believe that there's structural violence, then you would believe that public policy should do what it can to address these things. So I take it that structural violence has a political or normative valence. And so therefore it matters politically whether you believe it or not. Okay. So the problem, I don't think I have any more headings under this one. The problem is that all this relational talk, structural talk, makes perfect sense from a quantum point of view because it's holistic and entangled and so on. From a classical point of view, of course, all this structural, systemic, relational talk is nonsense. These unobservable, deep structures don't exist. They don't exist in a classical world, typically. And I think the classical argument would be that if you look closely at claims of structural violence, you will only see violence by individuals. You may see long chains of violence by individuals or concatenations of violence, but at the end of the day, there's nothing mysterious here. It's just individuals beating up on each other discursively, physically, whatever it is. So the classical response would be, there's no need for public policies because there's no problem here. There's no structural violence, so therefore there's no need for public policy. It's a nice metaphor, perhaps, but it's not real. That's, I think, the implication. Okay. So in this dispute between over critical race theory, perhaps is one of the examples between left and right, I would say this dispute is partly about ontology. Both sides are weaponizing their ontologies, trying to use them politically against each other. And it's not just structural violence that's at stake. You all recall, well, those of you who are old enough, most of you probably aren't old enough to recall Margaret Thatcher's famous claim that, quote, there is no such thing as society. There's just individuals. And that was an ideological basis for her program to reconfigure the British political economy, 50 some years ago. So, and to create more of a neoliberal free market kind of society. So for the classical view, it's individuals all the way down, so to speak. And the quantum view is saying that no, there's something structural, and that's normatively and politically significant. Okay, Well, that was the quantum class. So there was. Okay. So this is the larger second example, and this is the main punchline of the paper. And this is a bit more long-term effect, sort of a really intergenerational kind of argument that I want to make. And what I want to suggest is that not only is the classical view a problem for individuals in a society of structural violence and so on, but it's also tragic. Okay, so let me work up to this idea of a tragedy. So first of all, the intuition, I think, is really simple. For 2 or 3 centuries, first in the West and now globally, we've been teaching our children, and therefore teaching ourselves, that the physics of social life are classical. Now, we're not teaching that explicitly to grade schoolers and even high schoolers, but implicitly, I would say that's in fact what's being taught. And you see that when you get to graduate school, when people are taught very rigorous methodologies and statistics and everything else, they are taught those methodologies are all classical. In fact, quantum is not even mentioned typically. So anyway, going back to the idea of the physics of social life being classical, to me that means materialist, it means rational, it means kinetic, and above all, it means individualistic. The essence of the classical worldview is full separability of individuals. At least that's one of the essences, so to speak. And political liberalism as an ideology affirms and reinforces that assumption that individuals are separate. We all have our own human rights and everything else, and that's all separable, right? And this teaching, I think, begins at a very young age, but it reaches its apotheosis, if I can say that, in college and grad school method seminars, where we learn to model each other as intelligent, separable machines, basically. Now, my proposal is that this kind of teaching over many decades makes us become more like classical subjects. It trains and molds our minds to think in binary terms, in individualistic terms, in mechanical terms. Okay, now that's not the only kind of education we're getting. We're also getting lots of other influences that cut other ways. But the influence we're getting from the kind of ontology here is very much producing more individualistic, more classical subjects. And actually, empirically, there's indirect evidence for this, which is there's research has been done on the effect of teaching economics to undergraduates. And what they find is that economics undergraduates, the more they're exposed to economics, the more selfish and individualistic they become. So it's shaping their minds in going through college. And I would say the same thing is happening in producing classical minds. That's the same kind of argument. And actually, not just economics, think about nationalism. Nationalism takes babies who have no inherent national identity and stamps them with identities and socializes them with identities until by the time we're all grown-ups, we're all patriots for our nation, and not any other nation, just our nation. So that's, again, forming a subjectivity with some kind of top-down process. In that case, it's very deliberate versus the process that I'm talking about, which is less deliberate, perhaps. So the point here is that centuries of pedagogy, classical pedagogy, reinforced by liberalism, makes classical people. And if the brain is quantum mechanical, then that is not only a social construction, it's a social misconstruction of our true physical nature. It's a social misconstruction of our true physical nature. And it's a repressing awareness of our true quantum self in favor of a truncated, alienated classical self. Okay, so one bumper sticker here, it's the repression of quantum nature by classical nurture, is how I'm thinking about it. And the worst part of this is that it's tragic, not just for the alienated, truncated individuals it produces, the unhappy individuals we all are, but it's also tragic for society. And the argument there is that, and this is where entanglement becomes especially important, entanglement is a matter of degree. It's a variable in any situation. And quantum game theorists have shown mathematically that the more entanglement there is among the players of a quantum game, the more cooperation there will be relative to the classical baseline. And in fact, in mixed motive games and quantum game theory, my understanding is that all of them predict higher levels of cooperation than the classical counterparts do because of entanglement. Entanglement is this extra factor that helps people cooperate when they shouldn't, according to the classical view. And in fact, that's what we observe experimentally in the lab. Experimental game theorists have shown that people cooperate more than they should across, just like the Kahneman and Tversky stuff. Only in this case, it's game theory. People should not cooperate as much as they do. So you can see where this is going, okay? Teaching ourselves that we're fully separable machines is creating false consciousness, and in so doing, lowering our entanglement with each other, making collective action more difficult. So just when human beings need all hands on deck to work together to stop climate change and everything else that's going to destroy us, just when we need all that, we're stuck with these classical thinking machines in our brains that make it really hard for us to cooperate because we're thinking individualistically or more individualistic than we might be, okay? So the tragedy here is that the classical worldview helps to naturalize a very limited model of the human being, which might be wrong. I mean, in my view, it is wrong. And if it is wrong, to naturalize that is really to create false consciousness. And it's not warranted. It's selling human beings short in a sense. And it's reducing our ability to solve global problems. So the point here is that it matters what we teach ourselves in the long run for what kind of people we're going to become. Okay. So just to wrap up, with Lenin's question, what is to be done? So an entire worldview is the problem in a way. And so there's no quick fix, obviously. But a key would be quantum pedagogy, quantum education. And I don't mean just in grad school, I mean starting in kindergarten. And because it's too late by the time you get to grad school to change who you are. So I think we should be teaching kids, and this is Ron DeSantis's worst nightmare. It's not just critical race theory that we're going to teach. If we teach quantum stuff all the way down, I think we'll get a pushback from DeSantis. But the idea here is I think we can teach children that we are not material objects like those described by classical physics. We're living, first of all, and we're conscious, and arguably quantum objects with much greater potential than our classical cousins. And even kindergartners, and I think the place to start really is with logic, even kindergartners can move from either or thinking to both and thinking. And I think that's really the fundamental shift. And if you can get young people to think both and instead of either or, that might be at least one step along the road to a quantum transformation. But again, all of this only makes sense if we really are quantum beings. If we're not, then it's moot. But I think the question is an important one and shouldn't necessarily be sidestepped. Even if we don't have any evidence, we can still talk about what if and then think through the implications. So I will leave it at that, and I hope that wasn't too long. Well, it's a little long, but okay, I'm all done. So I don't know how you guys want to divide up the discussion, but please feel free. Okay, how do I maximize the screen here? Well, I'm not sure. Which one of you is going to go first?
I was suggesting Michael goes because I think your comments might feel closer to what Alex just said.
Okay.
Yeah, that works for me if you're able to hear me. Thanks very much for the invitation here. And I was just
sorry,
thinking,
a quick note, Alex, if you could unshare your screen, then maybe
unshare. That's what okay, that's what I was
Yeah,
there we go. Okay, great. Okay, Michael, go ahead.
yeah, thank you very much for the invitation here. And I was just thinking as you were discussing the example of the role that pedagogy can play here, I was thinking of all of the times that I've discussed quantum international relations with my theory seminars, the only time that I had a student choose the classical prediction of the Linda the banker example was when he confessed that he'd been spending the last few weeks on LSAT preparations. So perhaps there is something to this idea that as we train the classical brain, or as we train classical assumptions, that we see more of them in the world. So I'd like to begin my comments by asking you about the audience for this argument. I don't mean today, but more broadly, because the framing at the start of the paper appears to kind of take up the torch from William Bennett Monroe's APS, our American Political Science Association, presidential address. And the introduction of quantum social theory through that section of the paper similarly addresses a broad audience, drawing on analytical philosophy, ontology debates in international relations, epistemological debates in philosophy of social science, and various references across social theory. But when the article turns to a discussion of critical theory and especially critical pedagogy, I started to wonder if this is perhaps not a broad audience argument, but one for the crits. As you note, addressing a critical audience about quantum social theory can often be a difficult task, given the allegations of physics envy, physics fetishism, and reductionism that critical scholars have brought against, especially positivist social sciences, for decades now. So the paper is therefore careful in building its case that what a quantum theory does in social science is the same as what a critical theory does, especially in Frankfurt School formulations. And this section is especially thought-provoking in its use of concepts of false consciousness and alienation to bridge that divide and speak directly to the capital C critical theorists. Perhaps because my own background is within critical international relations, I was left wondering how this would resonate more broadly with the kind of general readership that the APSA presidential address bridge might indicate. I think this audience question is important because it brings forward a new kind of analogy versus actuality, or realism versus metaphor question. The first one obviously is whether we are using quantum terms as analogies for the world, or whether there is some foundational quantum consciousness that grounds social phenomena. But I think that there's a second question about actuality and analogy in your particular paper, which focuses instead on the relationship between quantum and critique. Is your argument that if political scientists, social theorists, and IR scholars writ large want to understand quantum social theory, we should use an analogy of critical theory to understand what quantum social theory is doing? Or is your argument for the crits that when we look at the philosophical practices of quantum social theory, it actually is a critical theory?
What's the difference?
So is it, are you using critical theory as an analogy to explain to a broad audience what quantum social theory is like? Or are you speaking to critical theorists to say that there is something actually critical about your approach to quantum social theory? So after audience, there's a second cluster of comments around the necessity of quantum within the logic of the argument. One part of this speaks to the quantum brain hypothesis, and you kind of address this in the framing of your paper, or in the framing of your presentation. So I'm curious if the truth of the quantum brain hypothesis is necessary for the critical function of quantum social theory, either in all cases or in your case. I ask this because folks applying evolutionary models or complexity theory may suggest that they have pushed back against the false consciousness of Newtonian determinism in a strict sense, even if their theoretical edifice broadly relies on Newtonian notions of causation, separability, etc. So does a critical consciousness that recognizes social Newtonianism as a false consciousness need to be grounded in quantum realism and the quantum brain hypothesis? Or is a broader quantum imaginary, quantum philosophy, or a pragmatic approach to the quantum-like world sufficient? This, of course, also speaks to that refrain that we get when we pitch the argument to critical and relational folks in international relations of, well, we can get there by taking a bit of this approach and a bit of this approach. Actor network theory flattens our ontology. Do we really need quantum to do that? I'm less interested in that part of the question and more in the logic. Finally, I would like to hear more about the notion of agency and how that fits into a critical political project. In the paper and in the presentation, we hear that classical teaching produces a false consciousness and diminished human agency in terms of collective action and those sorts of what we might call critical political projects or emancipatory political projects. And this leads to a suggestion that a classical pedagogy produces an alienated form of agency that privileges conflict over cooperation. We're further alienated even from ourselves through the fragmented form of the individual assumed by this false consciousness, which diminishes our autonomy as agents in the world. We then hear that overcoming this alienating pedagogy through a recognition of entanglement across time and through society may help develop a sense of self that grounds purposive action, and via quantum game theory, that this entanglement also serves as a resource for increased social cooperation. I wonder, however, if there's a more direct connection to be made between agency and entanglement. And here I was thinking of Karen O'Brien's understanding of quantum social change. O'Brien argues that recognizing entanglements provides a new path for engaging with social change. And so I have a quote here. When we are aware that we are entangled within a quantum system and part of the phenomena that we are measuring, we have a greater potential to open up inquiries with others and generate insights that are truly transformative. End of the quote. So recognizing these entanglements is for O'Brien a crucial step in empowering social change, because we can understand what it is that we are going to change and how we are situated within what will be changed. O'Brien suggests that it permits the mobilization of new modes of social change through collective storytelling, where we begin from a position where we assume our connection within society and social networks. So this brings me to my final question on agency and entanglement. Is entanglement the key to understanding the new agency that is possible within a quantum critical consciousness? And how does that vision of an entangled agency, although I'm not sure if that's quite the right term, how does that fit within your broader parallel between quantum social theory and critical politics?
Okay, well, that's really good. Should we do all three of you guys in a row and then I'll respond? I think, Morgan, does that make sense to you, Ben?
Makes sense. Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. So you're all set, Michael? Okay, thank you very much. That was terrific. Okay, so who's wants to?
Ben, I can go next or after you.
Go for it. Yeah, no, I'm happy to be the caboose.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to engage with Alex's project in a way that's a little different from Michael's. I'm a cultural anthropologist. So I've been thinking through our past 3 quantum boot camps, how a quantum approach could help the humanities and interpretive social sciences. I've been asking myself that question. Some of the social science orthodoxy that Alex is writing against in his books and in his presentations at boot camps are orthodoxies that, yes, the humanities and interpretive social sciences have already rejected for a long time. So this is sort of getting at your first point. So I'm going to spend a little time here, not to bash you, Alex, but just to set it up. Maybe
I'm used to it. So.
You're used to it. So yes, so these academic fields developed in the 20th century in part as a critique and counterpoint to mainstream political science, sociology, economics, and others. Physics envy was a term of deprecation, not pride, for the humanists. So when Alex wants to update the physics here or to resynchronize, a cynical response is simply, it's about time. You newcomers to the party, this is a party that the humanists have been doing for at least as long as quantum mechanics has been around, even though humanists do not tend to refer to quantum mechanics. So is Alex's project just backfilling what they've already long known? And so that's what I think my humanist colleagues would say, are saying to Alex, if they gave thought to quantum at all, which they usually don't. I, on the other hand, have participated in these boot camps with a different assumption, and with a hunch that a humanist should not be so dismissive. And part of the reason was I actually started as a physics major, ended up majoring in math, and then studied cultural anthropology, a social science, and now I'm appointed in a division of arts and humanities. And for me, that transition has always been smooth and natural. So that's, in that sense, I feel I belong in a camp like this. So this panel gives me a chance to try to air some of what I feel are deep resonances between disparate fields. And I think Alex's work is indeed a crucial corrective for mainstream social science for this task of bridging these very different disciplines. And so these are just some of my first thoughts about how we can extend the bridge maybe more into the humanistic approaches to human affairs. So, let me just jump to maybe speaking. I'm going to delve into two examples, and I'm going to do it through the last point that Alex made in his presentation concerning the pedagogy question. So I'm going to say what, Alex, I'm sure you've already thought about, which is, even if we somehow can try to make the case for this kind of re-educating our people, that there are entrenched interests that are more than Ron DeSantis for what is assumed to be scientific rigor in mainstream social science. Those interests guard this paradigm for professional integrity, for grad admissions to dissertation defensibility, grants, publications to leading journals and jobs. You know that. And so they also carry recognition of this paradigm as expert for policy circles, think tanks, and TV talk shows. And for example, anthropologists, for all their holistic perspective that emphasize making sense of human complexity and less so in explaining causes or making predictions, anthropologists have scant presence in these academic and public forums. And so they're not the go-to experts for questions of policy concern. So this is not a whine. I'm not whining as an anthropologist, but a diagnosis of those entrenched interests that valorize Newtonian models of human affairs. And it's a cautionary note that to the pedagogical project, that these forces are interlocked in various ways to stand against it, and the resistance is more than just intellectual. Like we can debate you on quantum versus Newtonian, but there are actual interests. But you know that. And so even if Alex's quantum critique of mainstream social science is factually accurate or even intellectually compelling, I think it is, those commanding interests are resistant to listen or change unless, and here's the part I want to explore a bit, there are multiple pieces of evidence that you can explain or make sense of human affairs better with a quantum framework. And this is what our boot camps are trying to start, to gather. That you can do better empirical social science from the perspectives of those such as here in the boot camp. Of course, even then, if we amass lots of evidence, that's absolutely no guarantee of any paradigm shift, which requires perhaps even a turnover of generations, as Thomas Kuhn has taught us. But let's still press forward about, never mind the practical difficulties of paradigm shifting. Let me try to add to the growing body of evidence of these past three boot camps, and to think about some problems that I've been thinking about that there are inadequate answers to, and I'm just trying to think about what's the best way of thinking about this. And so these are what we might call structural systemic problems. Alex has started this discussion. They've defied repeated attempts at political remedy and even adequate theorization, I would argue. A basic reason that the theorization of structural problems are inadequate is that they are premised on the incentives, motivations, and choices of individual agents that, whether they're set up in classical game theoretic frames, agent-based simulations, or not, that individualistic focus is what I think is problematic about understanding structural problems. So let me try to work out some examples to try to flesh out what we're already saying here in this panel. Racism. Alex again has mentioned this. I'm hoping to add to that. I take racism to be irreducible to the behaviors and attitudes of individuals. Those factors, the individual factors, do not begin to exhaust how racisms operate and persist in any social historical context. Nevertheless, the reduction of racism to individuals is a prevalent fallacy, at least here in the United States. And that fallacy is at base the perennial debates about CRT, critical race theory, the affirmative action issue, which was stirred up recently by the Supreme Court, US Supreme Court decision. The debate, at least on some sides, emphasized narratives of individual merit and grit as uniquely determinative of outcomes. And so the ethics is built on individual effort and character, and the ethics does not attach to the relevant structures themselves. So let me suggest as a sort of aside quickly that the difficulty for academics and politicians to explain structural factors depress some people, and the ease to affix simple derogatory labels like CRT will be another cautionary tale to Alex's pedagogical problem. It's so easy to think Newtonian, I guess, because of our conditioning, and very hard to explain structural. So how do I explain structural racism? And this is something I do with my students. It's inspired in part by the early 20th century Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, whose magnum opus, Moral Man, Immoral Society, suggests, even in the title, that the ethical evaluations of individuals can differ widely from the ethical evaluations of how they live together in a collective. So this dilemma is captured repeatedly in history, in literature, in films, where individuals who seem to operate with their own codes of honor, loyalty, probity, work to further institutions, apparatuses that perpetuate horrendous oppression or genocide. And so we have perhaps a familiar trope of the culturally refined, honest Nazi, or the figure of the soldier reading Goethe from his tank, and many other examples like that. Even Hannah Arendt's notion of the banality of evil may be read as another aspect of how great catastrophic collective evil is not reducible to the very mundane lives of individual cogs in the machine. So here's how I explain structural problems to my students. It's a sort of thought experiment, a Gedanken experiment, vielleicht. Imagine if every person, if we had a magic wand and waved the wand, and we can instantly change the hearts and minds of every individual in the United States, and so that they no longer treat anyone anymore differently because of their color of the skin. They judge them by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Let's say that dream was fulfilled with a snap of the finger. Would racism be ended by that magic wand? The answer is no, of course. You all know this. What would still persist, even if we change suddenly the hearts and minds of every individual? There would still be entrenched inequalities in wealth, health, exposure to environmental hazards, police stops, incarceration rates, roads, pipes, schools, social capital, knowledge, networks, all those things, and more. So all these inequalities are not reducible in their causes or in their operation by only, say, the negative reaction of a white person when they see a Black person. These are structural problems that transcend problems of only individual agents. Such a fantasy of reforming hearts and minds overlooks the entanglement of behaviors and attitudes among humans, and not just among humans, but with the built environment, with the legal regime, with the economy, I mean, so much more. So that is a complete view of the problematic structures here. Involves looking at oppressive collective practices and understandings of humans, and because it's very hard to act and think, speak differently from your social peers. In this sense, the structures in the agent, as Alex says in his paper, but also with non-human actants in this picture, that the infrastructure we just mentioned, the roads, the pipes, and so much more. So these are ultimately involved with racism writ large. And this is what Niebuhr would call structural evil. So a quick aside here, this hopefully will contribute a bit to our thinking. In my view, one big problem with Western Christian evangelical practice is the focus on what they refer to as individual sin. And not on the interlocking collective responsibility of what might be called communal sin. Evangelicals much less think about communal sin than other even Christian traditions. And this is partly what Niebuhr was writing against in the early 20th century, and it's not been heeded by very many evangelicals today. So therefore, abortion is the key cardinal sin, while higher death rates among minorities and the poor is not seen as a moral issue by the same Christians. And so it's not just social science that has this Newtonian problem, shall we say. I'm going to go faster on a second example concerning corruption. And corruption itself is a problematic term, which I do not use in my analyses, but I'll just use it as a shorthand since we all kind of know what it means, rather than saying patronal network practices and whatever. So corruption is a very funny phenomenon, isn't it? If you stop to think about it for a second, except for those on the very top who may be benefiting handsomely from that system. Most in society, if you asked anyone in any society, really, if you've been anywhere in the world, claim to hate corruption, what they call corruption. And they have tales about how outrageous the demands of this official or that clerk is. Yet, everyone participates in its practices. So everyone's actions and inactions plays a role in perpetuating something that they say they hate. So what is going on here? Isn't this a puzzle for the theorization of agency? Now, we can look at this at the level of the individual agent and say, okay, looking at the arrangement of incentives and disincentives, and perhaps calculate the Nash equilibria of certain corrupt states of affairs. There's a lot of good scholarship on that. So we understand why individuals might act the way they do in corrupt societies. It just costs too much and gains too little if you act otherwise. But that kind of analysis does not remove from me what I consider to be the key dilemma, is how did we get into the situation where the Nash equilibria are arrayed such that the least powerful are locked into oppression and extraction? The situation was not designed or masterminded in their specifics but by some cabal of very intelligent and very, very evil people in the top. Rather, it emerged from the practices of millions in their intra-actions with people, environments, material objects, infrastructures, laws, habits, bodily dispositions, ideologies, all this assemblage, heterogeneous assemblage interwoven to constitute dysfunctional societies and political economies. It's much more than a matter of individuals acting dishonestly. So, so in a sense, I may be just simply restating what we all kind of know about some of these problems, but I think I'm just trying to put to head that that the kind of framework that Alex and many of us here are trying to emphasize allow us to think about questions like racism or corruption in a much more natural way. The final question I'm not going to tackle, just as my ending note, is Alex's stronger ontological claim, which he just talked about very well. And I happen to think, I agree with him that I think most natural scientists will have no problem saying that the world, in fact, is best described as quantum and not Newtonian. We human beings are that way. At some level, our minds are too. I think at some level, there's no problem with that. It's just a question, what are the implications of that? And we're kind of trying to work, some of you in this boot camp are working that out. But one thing I do have a little note of caution, as I was thinking yesterday, when we were talking, when Don Hoffman was talking about theories of space-time that really go way beyond quantum mechanics. I do know, I'm just reading some popular writings of some physicists that there are theorists in trying to do quantum gravity, that they are thinking much further beyond the established framework of even quantum mechanics and radically thinking what nature of space-time. Dan Hoffman, an example, was just one of many what physicists are thinking about. So if that's the case, then is even Alex's project in fear of being superseded? But I don't think so. But that's just simply a different rear mirror threat that we might think about at some point. Anyway, thank you very much for this chance, Alex.
All right, thank you, Mark. And that was, I can't possibly answer all those questions, but I'll do the best I can when it's my turn. So, okay. All right, Ben.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to join you all to talk about this this paper and about this project. I'm deeply sympathetic to the thrust of the paper, and I think that this idea of sort of fully separable persons makes a very worthy target. I think quantum clearly helps us facilitate a kind of deeper rethinking of the very distinction between subjects and objects. It helps us reconceive agency and imagine everything as kinds of vibrant matter, to use Jane Bennett's phrase. So I think it's a hugely productive intervention. But I do have sort of three broad questions that I want to raise about it. And the first one, it sounds like, is perhaps a version of some of the, hopefully a nicer, more productive version of some of the comments that you got from reviewers in submitting it. So it's a question, this first question is about why the paper's argument that critical theory needs quantum, right? So it seems like the dialectic of the paper is that you try to force critical theory into a dilemma if it doesn't accept quantum, because of what you argue is the inadequacy of these other theories of meaning, of internalism and externalism. And my worry here is that I think this forces you to attribute too much power and coherence to the very classical frame that you're trying to undermine. That you're trying to show that the classical theory does undercut critical theory in a way that then requires the turn to quantum. But in making that argument, I worry that you're sort of strawmanning critical theory, even as you are attributing more power to the classical view than perhaps it deserves. So let me talk a little bit about why I'm raising that worry. So the first way to do that is just ask about the nature of this kind of slippery slope, or the inadequacy of critical theory that you're trying to diagnose. And in particular, this question you ask about where meaning is located, physically located in a place, right? And so I want to ask sort of, well, why does meaning need to be physically located? Is that really a requirement of what you call the CCP, the closed conception of physics? So you say in the paper, if meaning ain't in the head, then where exactly are they? If meanings ain't in the head, where exactly are they physically, right? And you say, according to the CCP, all mental objects must be instantiated in physical reality, where they will have correlated descriptions. And then you say, my strategy will be to use a quantum ontology to defend a popular mainstream view of holism that I argue is otherwise vulnerable to a weaponized classical critique. If we want to keep the holism, therefore, we'll need to bring a quantum view of the individual on board. And so I guess I want to question the effectiveness of that weaponized classical critique. You say, why isn't externalism vulnerable to the same Thatcheresque retort of structural violence? Quote, there are no such social meanings, only private ones. So I guess my first cut at responding to that question, which is sort of offered rhetorically, is that the very idea of a private meaning is incoherent, right? I kind of want to reach for my Wittgenstein, the philosophical investigations, and just say, well, meaning only has content if it's communicable. And if it's communicable, then it's already social. And so the idea of a private meaning that's being posed as an alternative here doesn't make sense on its own terms, that it has problems that reduce the force of it as an objection, right? But there's a broader question for critical theory, right? So you talk, I think, very well in the paper about the way that critical theory marries a realism with an emancipatory intent. But one of the things that I think is underdiscussed in the paper is that critical theory sees freedom and normativity as being related to reason. So part of the problem, part of what makes us alienated isn't just that our life is inauthentic, but that it's irrational in some sense. And I wonder if that conception of reason is one that can be reduced to physical location, right? Or if critical theory is offering a view that isn't vulnerable to the weaponized classical critique in quite the way that the paper suggests. So, right, if we think about sort of classical forms of irrationality or really simple forms of irrationality, I should say, like, well, where is, like, reason in this kind of sense can't be reducible to a mental object or a physical location. There are going to be physical instantiations of it, but it won't be reducible to it. Otherwise, if it were, we would lose the normativity of it, right? So where does 2 + 2 = 4, right? Of course, we can point to neurological activity making this connection, but if somebody's brain misfires and says 2 + 2 = 5, well, we can say that they're wrong, right? And we can do that using our reason, right? And the fact that we can correct people in that way, that there's a normativity to our reasoning in that sense, I think escapes, that normativity is something that escapes the need to be physically located. I'm just not sure what kind of a sort of a meta-ethical question. I think there are moral realists who would say that moral facts are facts of the kind that anything else is. But for others who have more relational views, reason isn't that kind of a thing. And so I wonder if it remains vulnerable to this weaponized classical critique. Let me give a couple other examples, because it seems to me like in general, asking what caused an action is different from asking about the meaning of an action. And I do think that sometimes those are run together in a way that makes critical theory look more incoherent than it is. So the paper in sort of, I want to return in particular to the example of structural violence that you give and to ask why structural violence poses a problem, why it isn't explicable under sort of more familiar terms. So to do that, because you say, for example, on page 46, structural violence is not physically possible, right? You argue that there's a kind of non-local action at work that classical, that can only be explicated on a quantum view. But I'm just not, I guess I'm not quite sure why that would be true of structural violence, even accepting a lot of what Morgan said about the way in which it's not reducible to individual attitudes, which I think, of course, is right. I think the reason that the concept of structural violence is introduced is to engage quite deliberately in some normative conceptual stretching, that is to reorient what we understand as violence, not to introduce, as it were, novel causal pathways. So going back to the 1969 article by Johan Galtung, Violence, Peace, and Peace Research, where the concept is first introduced, Galtung defines the narrow concept of violence as the deprivation of health at the hands of an actor who intends this to be a consequence. Right, so that's obviously a very familiar and straightforward kind of way of thinking about causation here. And I think it's notable that the reason Galtung rejects this narrow definition of violence is normative. He says highly unacceptable social orders would still be compatible with peace if we accepted that definition of violence. And so he offers a broader definition of violence that's still physical, right? He says violence is present when human beings are influenced so that their actual somatic and mental realizations are below their potential realizations. And so what structural violence is on this view is when the structural violence is present, when the distribution of resources and decision-making power cause some people to fail to realize their full capacities, right? And we can measure that. Now, I think there's room for quantum here, right? The very introduction of the idea of potentialities and failure to realize, I think, suggests that there is something else going on here. but my point is that this is meant to be an interpretive and normative concept from the start. It's not meant to be introducing a novel form of causation. And so I don't quite understand in that sense why it's meant to pose a problem. I had the same kind of question about some of the other examples of non-local social action that you include, including the example about Socrates and his wife becoming a widow. I guess, and this is maybe just a naive question, but I'm not sure what I see what the mystery is, right? Of course, this is an important change in social status, but I guess, you anticipate this, right? You say in the paper, skeptics may see no mystery here because these effects all depends on social conventions, which is true. But how are these conventions instantiated physically? And I guess this is where the motivation question is, which is that I would like for people who aren't already bought in that sense, a clear sense of what the stakes are. And in particular, why we should expect there to be a general answer to that question. It seems to me like there might be multiple different answers to that question, depending on the details of the case. And so I wonder what is exactly the force that's leading to this sense of lack here. Maybe a different way of framing it then, not to suggest that dialectics or critical theory as it exists is incoherent, but to suggest that there's always already been a kind of quantum that's implicit in it might make more sense. There are ways in which you connect this, right? You talk in the paper more than in the presentation about Hegel's master-slave dialectic. And I do think in that Hegelian tradition of thought, there's always implicitly accepted something like superposition, right? The idea of dialectics has always been comfortable with contradiction in a way that, you know, is clearly fruitful. So there's clearly a connection. But I wonder if the most effective strategy for reaching critical theorists is to suggest, not to suggest that their views are inadequate, but to suggest perhaps instead that they've always already implicitly accepted some of what you're pushing them to make explicit. Let me make one other paper on that point, on that first point. So this sort of subpoint 2 on the first thing. Because I was struck that in the paper, you note that even without taking quantum on board, it's clear that the individuality of people is an ideological construction, since, as you suggest, we're partly constituted by billions of bacteria, which we couldn't survive without. Right now, this seems like a potential ally to you politically, right? It's another way of undermining this form of individuality. But in the paper, you bracket it. You say, luckily, we can bracket the issue here, perhaps because it suggests that there are other reasons beyond quantum for accepting some of these political conclusions. So I wonder if there might not be another way to address that, particularly because I think some of this connects to other forms of critical theory like queer theory. You say in the paper, the body seems to present itself always as an already collapsed classical object. But going back to sort of Judith Butler and gender trouble and Foucault, of course, before that, there are various ways in which that very idea has been troubled without taking quantum on board. There are many people for whom the body does not present itself in that kind of settled way, and to whom the politics of bodily enclosure has always been clear. So again, that's another place where I would just be cautious and say, I think political theory may be more capacious or do more work in this direction that can survive your kind of weaponized classical critique. 2 other brief points. One is about the nature of the classical view itself, which I think does sometimes emerge as a kind of doctrine without history. And I wonder if it might not be useful either. This probably can't all fit in one paper, but in the project more generally, right, as actually has already come up, there are ways in which the classical view of physics itself is coming out of theological debates. It's coming out of political debates itself. Right. So a lot of the work that was done by philosophers and scientists like Descartes and John Locke to explain how this emergent modern physics was compatible with prevailing religious beliefs has had enduring structures, right, enduring influence on the way that these views have been taken up and what their political implications are. Right. So a lot of the politics of individualism comes out of efforts to show how free will could be preserved alongside classical physics, and in particular, why individuals could and should still be held responsible for sin, even if their actions were physically caused in some sense, right? And so I think if we look in the tradition of thinking about this eventually, I think trying to reconcile these tensions is part of what turned politics and political philosophy to a philosophy of history. We see, for example, in Kant, and then in Hegel, importantly for the history of critical theory, and then to a theory of progress to explain why human freedom and its misuse was still compatible with the belief in a providential God. Now, I don't think we need to get into these deep theological debates in order to make the heart of the argument, but part of why I mention this is that I think engaging a little bit more with the history of how and why the classical view emerged and why it was adopted could also give us insight into what might lead it to be discarded. And so that's really my third point, which is about the paper's view of how the classical view could be displaced. Because although critical theory believes, as I've already suggested, in the normative and diagnostic power of reason, it doesn't always believe that the force of reason will displace false views, right? There's lots of things that keep false views in place. And so views like this kind of classical view or the conception of individuality that you associate it with it are hegemonic for material reasons, right? So part of why it's worth, I think, connecting the classical view to this history of theology and theodicy that it's connected to is that's part of where we also get the sociodicy of the market, right? The idea that the market is going to be good in the long run, that competition is for the best for everyone, even if it's harmful in the short term or harmful for particular individuals, right? All of this is related to this model of individuality and of the individual and the nature of the individual that comes out of this sort of stew. But now that it exists, even though it was developed for these other purposes, right, it's maintained its plausibility for a variety of other reasons. So while I think it makes sense to focus on education, and this again connects to some of the other points about what are the forces keeping these things in place, right? What would it take to sort of dislodge the forces keeping false beliefs in place, given that there's now a status quo that is built upon it and that there are people who have interest in the maintenance of the status quo? Unfortunately, just telling people they're wrong isn't usually enough to get them to stop. And I also think, importantly, right, as critical theory reminds us, we live in a world of suffering and injustice. And so being entangled with others is hard, right? The idea that we're actually entangled with suffering others and that might provide a ground not only for cooperation, but empathy. People have a reason to want to reject that, right? It's life is hard enough as it is. And so people have a reason to kind of make themselves cold and shrink from entanglement with others if they think that means entangling themselves with the suffering of others. And I think that that's not something that education alone can dislodge. And so I do think forces like that, not only in that sense, the kind of narrow self-interested economic forces, but the other affective forces that attach to our individuality, that attach to this kind of separateness, are things that need to be sort of wrestled with. So I totally endorse the paper's views about sort of false consciousness and alienation. I think it's a really productive way to think about alienation. I think it just needs that kind of mediating term, right? Where for a lot of critical theorists, alienation isn't simply a matter of false belief, but about something that sort of structurally mediates our understanding of ourselves, and that even if we change our conscious beliefs, if those structures maintain the existence, they're still going to intervene in our self-understanding in ways that are irrational, to go back to that. So hopefully those points are helpful or at least coherent. And again, thanks for having me. I really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you also, Ben. Let's take a 2-minute break, and then I'll think about in those 2 There we go. All right. So should I be looking at myself? How should I make this view different? Gallery. There we go. Okay. All right. Well, I knew this would happen if I had three smart discussants that there'd be no way. I mean, I really want to just listen to the comments all over again so that I understand what you guys are saying. I mean, there's so many things I could respond to. It's 3:15 and we've got 6 questions. I think my inclination is to take some questions from the audience first and then see what they want to pick up on and what they want me to talk about a bit more. And then if necessary, I'll probably do one-on-ones with each of you later, if that's okay. But I'll do what I can in here. But let's see what the other people have to say as well, and then take it from there. Does that sound like a reasonable procedure? Okay, all right. So the Q&A, let's see, should I just read them? So Derek, I know Derek. One of the things that I have learned over the years of study is that individualism is not a natural relationship between humans and the environment or nature, but something that almost uniquely began with phonological literacy that separated subjects from objects. Would you like me to explain more? Yes, but I guess I'm not sure that now is the place, but that's never actually, I've never seen that, but that makes a lot of sense. And so I'm going to make I'll make a note of that. I think I can save all these comments at one way or the other. So that's a very interesting point. And I'd love to hear more. So should I keep going? Yeah, okay. There's no actual name. Well, I don't know what the name is. It's the last name, perhaps. As a linguist and sociologist, I would like your comment on the possible implications of taking into account quantum theory of mother tongue, quantum language, as the key transmitter of collective consciousness and collective memory before thinking of quantum education. Well, actually, yes. I mean, and in my book from a few years ago, I make a big deal out of language being quantum. And in a way, language is the fundamental social quantum thing that everything else is made out of. So I agree that the mother tongue and language is actually going to be crucial for making everything else. That's what entangles us all, really, is a shared language, shared meaning, and so on. So is the key transmitter of, well, but education is, well, yeah, actually, the mother tongue begins before education in a way. It begins the day you're born, essentially. You start getting hit immediately with all these words. Although arguably that's still education, it's just not formal education. So I guess I'll have to think about that. But I think the intuition is right, that language is the foundation of the whole story. And I didn't emphasize that in my talk, but that's certainly something I believe. So we have another comment from Derek. Well, several, 4 or 5 comments from Derek. Well, let's see. I'm hesitant to, okay. Well, this may be too many points from Derek. I'm thrilled that Morgan put his emphasis on individualism, maybe coming from what Morgan belongs in. Is that quite different? That too has to do with this. Okay, I don't have anything to say about that. And of course, Morgan will come back to Christianity. Yes, Morgan, you are talking about interactions of people. Okay, that is what we need to learn. Maybe violence comes from a loss of identity, which is what a lot of people rushed into the next new thing. Well, these are less questions than comments, very interesting comments that I'm going to print out and I'll have to think about them. They're not typically have questions embedded, but they may be things that I can use anyway, nonetheless. So, okay. So other questions from the audience. Anybody? Otherwise, I'm going to start looking through my notes and from the discussants and starting to reply. Yeah. Wow. I mean, it's hard to take notes on so much stuff. Well, I like Morgan's point about, am I backfilling what critical theorists already know? And in a way, that's what the skeptical comment that I get up front, really, which is, we've already got this covered, we've already been doing this, welcome to the party, you're about 30 years late. And I think one thing that critical theorists do not know is how their theory or their framework attaches to the physical world. So it's kind of disembodied in a way in the social world. And so there's a question about the physical basis, whether that's classical or quantum. And so I think that's one thing that the quantum argument brings in. But in a sense, I do think that I am backfilling a lot of the argument. I'm trying to provide some kind of foundation, because as we all know, critical theory is not a majority theory in social science. It's hanging on at the edges of social science, basically. And so even if the critical theorists don't think much is being added, well, maybe if we add some physics or add some foundational stuff, maybe critical theory will be more epistemically persuasive. It's the fact that it's disconnected, I think, from science and positivism that makes it harder for the mainstream to kind of look at critical theory and take it seriously. I was raised on critical theory in grad school, Marxist state theory and everything. And, I'm not normally associated with critical theory in IR. Somehow I got cast out. I'm not sure how that happened, but I very much agree that what I'm trying to do is kind of connect critical theory to quantum. But I like the point that Morgan also made about entrenched interests. And actually, Ben, you made this point too, I think, that the entrenched interests are there and they're not going to go away. And I like, Morgan, your example of, well, if you could have a wave a magic wand, would that end racism? And I take the point, no, it would not. It would be, there's all kinds of inequality that would have to be overcome. Now, if you did change everybody's mind with that wand, my guess is it would be easier to overcome the inequality, and there'd be more willingness to do that. But you're right, it doesn't by itself solve the problem of racism per se. And quantum is implicit in Hegel, yes. Ben, I think that quantum is implicit in any kind of holistic social theory. It's implicit in my 99 book in a way, even though I never mentioned quantum, because it's a holist argument. Actually, that's one thing that, if I had, this is a totally side point, but if there's one frustration I had with the reception of my first book, is that nobody picked up on the holism of the argument. It was, in my mind, one of the central ideas, and it's not something that anybody ever criticized or celebrated or anything. It just kind of was not really part of the story in the commentary and stuff, which has been frustrating. But so quantum for me is a very natural extension, even though it's in a lot of ways different than my first book. The fundamental message is the same. It's holism is really what I'm trying to sort of ground scientifically. And Michael, just looking at his, and the audience issue is really crucial, and this is where I'm getting tripped up. There's no question. And I take the point that there is kind of a move early on between a very broad audience, and then suddenly it's the crits or the audience and so on. And so that has to be sorted out. There's no question. And is the truth of the quantum brain stuff necessary for the utility of the argument? Well, not necessarily. I mean, we could be completely agnostic about what brains are like and just say, well, let's teach people to be more relational and holistic and more friendly to each other and more sociable. We'll try to make them better people that way. And one could do that, and that might have some success. But if human beings' brains are fundamentally classical, and if our individuality is kind of biologically given and all that, then any attempt to socialize us into being more loving, sharing people is in a way running up against our nature. And it's pushing against nature. And I think the idea here is to push with nature. If quantum is in fact what the brain is like, then this kind of socialization would not be pushing against the grain or pushing against nature. It would be pushing with. So but I don't think that it's necessary to make the argument. And clearly people have made these arguments in some ways without ever mentioning quantum before. So in that sense, there's no strict necessity to it. But I'm glad, Michael, that you pointed out Karen O'Brien's point about entanglements being a new path for social change. I mean, I had forgotten that Karen did that in the book, and that's actually a really important point, and I can use that certainly in my story here. So, I mean, I've got much more I could say, but I don't want to just keep talking. I want to see if anybody else has anything that they want to add from the audience. Although we still have the same, well, there's Derek. We've got a lot of comments from Derek. I know Derek, by the way, so it's okay if I'm teasing a little bit. Well, is there anything that I should pick up on in particular in the view of the discussants? Nope, looks like not. Well, I mean, we could talk about Socrates and Xantippe and stuff like that. I mean, it's, you know, whether that's, you know, the most useful for everybody else. You know, I think to me, the Socrates example, and I think I'm actually tracking what I understand to be kind of the mainstream philosophical analysis of that example, which is that the effect on Xantippe is not a causal effect. It's because there's no kinetic, there's no exchange of energy, nothing. She just suddenly her status changes. Yep, you should put these comments, including in the cat for all to see. Oh, I'm not sure. So I didn't realize people can't see Derek's comments. Is that the case? Let me see. Oh, wait, we've got Kirk McGregor. Okay, well, here's a new one. Here's a new question. Okay. I'd like to follow up on one of Benjamin's questions about structural violence and a degradation of maximal potentials given two physically empirical points from quantum physical experimentation. Maximum potentials are very rare to capture and manipulate, and often something saliently less than maximal occurs experimentally with some characterization of integration of noise as less than closed system interactions. And when Feynman described a quantum physical operation as poorly accessible, that seems to imply the recharacterization of social entanglement is practically and empirically poorly accessible for similar reasons as a regular function of exposure to a noisy environment. My follow-on question is, if there is such a phenomenon as social entanglement, why wouldn't it be normally rare and not normally common or easily, and inferentially from your assertions entitled as a human right, accessible? Well, that's a very complex question. I'm not sure I understand much of it, but I do think that the point about the noisy environment and so on, and this kind of ties back to a comment that we just heard in the previous, was it, I think it was the first talk today, Emmanuel Pofo's talk, where he talked about the quantum Zeno effect. And my understanding, one way to think about social structure and the stability of social life is the constant repetition of everybody. And this would be a Judith Butler point, I suppose, too. The constant repetition by all these millions of people of roughly similar practices that sustain, keep relatively stable certain shared beliefs. And my understanding of the quantum Zeno effect is that if you just keep measuring like crazy, you can prevent things from degrading and coming apart. And I think that's in fact what happens in society, is we are so habituated and we're so well trained to obey the law and to do all the right things and everything, that creates a tremendous amount of stability at the social level. And that social stability in turn constitutes us as individuals with certain ideas in our heads and everything else. So, so I think that there is an argument, there is a question about the stability of these things at the quantum, because one of the points about quantum effects is that when you aggregate upward, they often disappear, they wash out and so on. And so finding a way to avoid that is crucial. For me, though, the crucial point, and this goes back to quantum brain theory and consciousness, if the brain is a quantum computer, then it's gonna have all kinds of potentialities that our brains, if they're classical, don't have. And presumably, if we're all running around with quantum computers in our head, there's going to be entanglement between those computers. And the fact that we're able to communicate with language, and our language and our words are relatively stable in their meaning and so on, suggests that there's some kind of stabilization process there. And I guess that would be a quantum Zeno process, but I'm not sure because I don't know this stuff well enough to know. But that's just a very quick response to a very deep question. So, and Derek says, I would like to be able to get that I think quantum theory is necessary to understand how we think. Well, I mean, I think quantum theory, well, I mean, it is possible to think things without quantum theory, and I suppose people have done that for a long time before quantum theory was invented. There are lots of precursors. I mean, actually, a lot of Eastern traditions, as people have commented several times in this workshop, Eastern traditions have lots of quantum elements, and of course, they predate quantum by millennia in some cases. But there was another question at the bottom, Nick Vincent, what would a quantum sociology inspired pedagogy look like? Would you explain more about an elementary school age approach, quantum for kindergartners? Well, you know, I don't teach kindergartners. I once had a couple of them. I think that in kindergarten, you're not going to be able to do a whole lot with quantum thinking. On the other hand, children may be much more open to quantum thinking than grown-ups because they haven't had years and years of classical socialization. But I think it would mean, I think, as I said at the very end of my talk, starting with both and instead of either or is kind of the fundamental logical structure that we want to inculcate into people. And when people think that way, they're going to think much more quantumly than they will if they're always thinking in either or terms. But I don't know what that pedagogy would look like in detail. Part of it would involve identifying the classical moments in pedagogy in grade school and high school. Where are the points where people are getting more explicit training in classical thinking, figuring those out. I think would be important. Morgan's got his hand up, so let me pass the baton.
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking about also helping with answering Nick Vincent's question.
Sure.
I'm thinking, just occurred to me, but thinking about making a connection with some moves among academics about foregrounding indigenous knowledges, which is happening across various disciplines. And so the idea is that this is part, at least in anthropology, with what we call the ontological turn in anthropology, but about taking seriously truth claims about the world of subjects that we studied in anthropology. So a Native Australian or Native American sort of views of the world. So I think that the point has been made by many people, including Native scholars, Native activists, Native people, grandmothers and grandfathers, that various ways of raising children in the non-modern, non-Western world embeds a lot of what I think you're trying to get at, Alex, and what others are trying to get at from other angles with non-quantum agendas. But I think in a sense, you might have fellow travelers in this sense of getting away from individualistic, selfish, self-maximalizing of subjects, but thinking communally, thinking about connection with environment, with places. Then there are also the questions about how much of the ontology do you have to import, how much of religious frameworks you have to import, the sacredness of mountains and so forth. But at least there are some attempts by some educators to say, can we teach children and more broadly in some of these native wisdoms? I have a different point, but I think maybe Ben wants to talk about this.
Well, can I just briefly respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, no, I'm very much, I've been sort of tracking at a distance the indigenous knowledge conversation. And there are a couple papers now there's a really nice paper by Nora Bowman from a couple of years ago, which is basically looking at the Canadian state as a classical Newtonian, imperial power, and indigenous peoples are negotiating and confronting this state with an implicitly quantum perspective. And it's a really neat piece that kind of combines indigenous knowledge, a lot of knowledge of indigenous knowledge, with this kind of quantum stuff. And there are maybe one or two other papers of this kind. So, and on the raising kids thing, actually, I had another idea. I just came across a distinction that somebody made recently about there are two ways to raise children. There's the carpenter model, where you're sort of cutting them and make them into what a certain kind of structure. And there's the gardener model. And the gardener model is, it's more organic and more, laissez-faire and so on. And that's a more quantum model. The carpenter model is clearly classical because you're cutting up wood and it's nailing it together. The gardener model, because it's dealing with living organisms, I would say is intrinsically quantum. So maybe it's getting the kids out of the wood shop and into the garden is the key to sort of training them. I'm not sure. That's a little bit flippant, but I think there's something to the two different models of child rearing. So Ben, please.
Oh, well, I guess in a certain sense, it just underlines part of the point you're making, which again, I think that there's a danger of exaggerating the coherence and hegemony of the classical model in our thinking, and that there are resources for thinking about entanglement and cooperation internal to many of these traditions, that all these traditions, if we look at them closely, are going to turn out to be a lot more complicated than the kind of simple caricatures that we're offering. And so as we think about pedagogy in particular and trying to reach people where we are, I mean, I think there's an enormous value in indigenous thinking, but I also wouldn't underestimate the other resources that are already available to those of us who are not indigenous, those of us who are settler colonists and others, even within our own kind of intellectual traditions.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, my task really is, and this goes back to the question of whether I'm just backfilling what everyone else has already done and already knows. And I think there is some of that. On the other hand, this is a language that positivists can speak potentially, and people, defenders of a scientific project in social science, can presumably, they should see quantum theory as a scientific intervention and so on. And so this may be a way to strengthen the critical trajectory or critical voice with a language that normally is not so they don't normally deploy, but it's a very powerful language relative to some of the alternatives. So we got a few more. Oh, well, go ahead, Morgan. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I have a different kind of point, but maybe you want to take some questions. I'd rather hear from other people.
Well,
I'll come back.
I'm just seeing. Okay, I think I've covered everybody. So, oh, wait, here's Derek. To finish my new comment, I think quantum theory is necessary to understand how we think, because it is that which will be the critical way people can realize how they are fully responsible for how the world is evolving for better or worse. The point is that the individualism still dominating reduces the level of consciousness people have of how every cut is affecting everything else. But I am only at the very beginning of this investigation. No, I agree with that completely. I think that we're on the same page, Derek. Let's see. Is there anybody else in this list? Oh, wait, Patty. Okay. Third and key move in deconstruction is beyond both and, to, and neither nor. Okay, that's neat. This is the space of the new, or a kind of thinking where we haven't been, at least in sciences. Might this be pertinent to the critique of critical paradigm and the effort to use quantum as a corrective, e.g. perhaps especially to the concept of false consciousness? Well, I'm not sure that the concept of false consciousness needs a corrective. I've always been attracted to the idea, although it's a tricky concept, obviously. But no, I hadn't actually thought about the neither nor, and I guess I have to think about how that relates to either or and both and. Is it really a third? I guess it must be a third logical category. I'll have to think about that. That's really interesting. And what is the space of the new? That I don't know either. So just going to make a note here, just a second. All right. Okay. Let's see. Let's go to Zrinka. Working intensely in education, I think this is a fruitful example. I'm kind of developing post-materialist education and see how it is coining the youth now. Nevertheless, the problem is when creating quantum education society that people in science expect one to look in all directions, systems theory, habitus theory, etc., and argue against it instead of going forward. I wonder if one or another convergence between classical and quantum approaches might be helpful as a step out into the broader space. Would you be open to convergences, or would you neglect it completely? UNESCO is talking about itself as a holistic organization, as well as indigenous groups and some other of those systems have been described as holistic. Also, the question how humans have been depicted in school textbooks is highly interesting because solely reduced to the material side of life. Now, the examples might be helpful. Now, that's interesting. I hadn't actually thought about this at all. The convergence between classical and quantum, well, presumably quantum subsumes classical at some level. You should always be able to recover the classical outcomes from a quantum approach. So I don't mean to sort of say we're going to do just quantum and not classical. And clearly the brain is both. You know, it's a massive classical structure, and even if it is also a quantum structure. So I would be open to the convergences, I guess. Since I'm sort of focusing on the differences, you know, I'm wary of getting into convergences too quickly. I don't want to lose kind of the edge, but that's intriguing, and I'll have to think about that. Okay. Let's see. We do have Derek's comment. And finally, I will stop pestering you all, but this is addressed to Morgan. The huge difference between phonographical literacy and iconic writing is that the first contains completely whatever it has to say, whether merely to read the second, you need to bring the context forward before you get at the text. The problem with Western people and Western science is that the text always is prioritized, whereas it is the context that is everything at once instead. Morgan, do you want to say, can you see this?
Yes, I do see it. I have read it. Yes, thank you, Derek. I sort of see it as more tendencies in Western thinking versus non-Western thinking, various indigenous knowledges or Asian traditions. That I think all acts of interpretation do involve text and context in different ways. It's just that there's an ideological prioritization for text, perhaps in certain Western traditions. So I think that's that analogy with phonology and sort of iconic writing is an interesting one. I have to think about that. It sounds like you're gesturing to some scholarship that I haven't looked at. But yeah, there's some interesting parallels with the way languages work at different levels of syntax versus phonology, for example. That's interesting. I do want to make a comment to Alex in light of Michael's original comments in this, and that is back to the question of who your audience is, or rather, you have multiple audiences, obviously, Alex, but maybe a strategic question of who you want to address first, or primarily at this stage of your big quantum project, and that is that it seems to me that even in light of my comments, I was being facetious partly about humanists, saying, "Okay, you're finally at the party, huh?" But I think you do have a substantive point to a lot of social science as it is now constituted, all those entrenched interests. And I think you should direct your energies, your firepower to that, because that's where you're coming from, your department. And that really is a set of institutions and interests that affect broadly beyond political science departments, but in policy making sources and other, and on CNN, talking heads and so forth. And so I would say, in a sense, forget the humanists, forget my critique, direct it as you originally have, and your colleagues in your very department, in your field, and get that thing published in some highly visible political science journal, respected, but in terms that can somehow engage with them and maybe get them to think again. A lot of us have said that alone does not change minds or shift paradigms or change education systems, but at least it's one thing you can do. That's your job as an academic, to write against what you see to be serious deficiencies in your own discipline. Start there, and then build outwards, and probably with colleagues like us and others that you assemble, fellow travelers from different fields, but you can broaden the audiences and agendas later on. But I think your first priority are your fellow political scientists.
Although they're the tough, well, The
They're
crits
tough.
may be
Yeah.
tougher customers actually than the mainstream people. They don't want any of this, right? Just stay away, stay away. No, that's very interesting. And actually, that was my target. And I never intended to make critical theory a target. It was really enlisting critical theory and giving it this kind of quantum gloss in order to make a point against the mainstream. But I need to make that much more clearly if that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, it is. I mean, part of me thinks that crits will at least have a conversation. They may bash this, but they'll probably react. Positivists, I'm not sure, are going to even react. It's like, oh, more of the same or whatever. So they're a very hard audience to engage. And just based on the kinds of reviews that my book has gotten, both from, well, the positivists, actually the crits and the positivists both hate the book. So in that sense, it doesn't really matter. But Ben, you've got your hand up, sorry.
Oh, no, well, it was just sort of following on this. I was wondering, part of why I brought up the question of normativity and its relationship to quantum thinking is that it does seem to me like in a real way, that's actually the nub of the disagreement with positivists. I mean, you embrace in this paper this sort of emancipatory intent of engaging in social scientific work. And of course, that just opens up other questions about how does one engage with that kind of normative work with the best available kinds of empirical methods, and it doesn't solve anything, but it does strike me that in a certain sense that's actually the decisive step that a lot of mainstream political scientists would reject, that they don't embrace the emancipatory intent, quite apart from the switch from classical physics to quantum mechanics. And so I do wonder, I mean, in that sense, you really set yourself a difficult task here, because you're asking them not only to give up their mechanistic model of physics, but you're also asking them to acknowledge the fact that what they're doing is a value-laden activity. I wonder if there are ways in which, rather than that being a kind of double burden, there might be some synergies, right? And to suggest that in fact, if that the embrace of quantum mechanics might make it easier or more comprehensible to mainstream folks to accept the normativity of what they're doing. But anyway, it's just sort of to think out loud about what the major challenges.
That's very interesting comment, because you're right, it doubles the burden. I mean, it's bad enough to attack their ontology. And then if I'm also saying you have to sort of think you're engaging in value-laden inquiry, that's going to be too much to swallow. Although I'm not sure that, I mean, the whole point about emancipatory intent and alienation, that's all value stuff. So I can't ditch that. So maybe it's a matter of helping that pill go down more easily rather than, that's very good. Michael, you want to pick up on this, or?
Yeah, I've got just a thought on how the audience question and the relationship to the project of critique kind of interconnect. And that's because I think the presentation of quantum as a critical practice for conventional political scientists, I think, will be less attractive because, well, they've made the choice to not be critical political scientists already. And on the other hand, introducing quantum as a form of social inquiry that can beat the positivists at their game would be less, or maybe less attractive to critical theorists who have rejected the premises of that game.
Right.
And I think part of that is the relation, or establishing the relationship between social and physical ontology, as you put it in your book's title, that for many folks within different critical scholarly communities, they perceive their work as already having done that. So there's a first kind of second level of critique to demonstrate how, say, an actor network theorist has not actually, followed through Latour's lesson of the separation of social and natural worlds being artificial, but in fact there is a Newtonian substrate or some sort of Newtonian limit to the core premises of the thought.
But that would force me to then engage with critical theorists directly, right? And to critique them, which I don't want to do. Well,
Yes.
so you're saying I should focus on the mainstream though also. Is that the lesson of your comment or not?
Well, I think the lesson of my comment is that it's likely impossible to do both in the confines of one article.
Right, yeah. So given the paper that you've read, which ideally I obviously have to do surgery on, but I hopefully I won't have to start from square one. Which of the two audiences would you say I should tackle?
I think that this about the second half onwards, when you get into the pedagogy discussion as well, I think that sorry, as a primary focus, I think that would be more interesting to critical theorists.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I think the front half could be pitched as, hey, to the curious positivist who may have heard of quantum social theory and not quite understand why ideas from physics are coming into political science. And it could be almost a thought experiment of what you're doing in the paper that the second half turns into, where you say, well, if you need a model to understand what quantum social theory is like, think of it as a critical enterprise that focuses on mental models related to separability, causality, et cetera, rather than the economic structure. I see Wes has a comment in the Q&A that addresses a similar
Let
issue.
me see here. Oh, Wes Widmeyer, I know you. Thanks to all for the fantastic panel. I just have a framing policy question following up on Michael's point about audience. Is it possible that some, not all, critical objections to claims for a quantum ontology are a little bit pretextual, and that critical theorists really object not to ontological premises, but rather to possible communitarian pragmatic conclusions? This may argue for a framing of the contribution as speaking to wider debates. Morgan's mention of Niebuhr highlights the possibility for building a bridge to pragmatists, possibly. Speaking as a Keynesian who sees the quantum ontologies providing a more robust foundation for a more communitarian macroeconomics, I know Marxists will often oppose these arguments. To be sure, Marxists may criticize any quantum ontology as irrelevant, although they shouldn't, I mean, if they're holistic. But their main concern will be that macroeconomics are themselves a form of false consciousness. So I'm not sure what the upshot of that is. I read it very quickly. What does pretextual mean? I guess I don't know, are a little bit pretextual, and critical theorists really object. So I'm not sure. Wes, maybe you can send me an email later and help me understand what you're getting at here, because it seems like it might be important. But so the consensus of the three discussants, you guys agree that, well, so what I'm hearing from Michael is that the paper, the first half is really targeted at positivists, and the second half is for interests of the crits. That's not going to be a successful paper. I mean, it might be. Maybe I can find a way to stitch them together. I mean, to me, the second half of the paper is much better than the first half. I mean, in the sense that there's just way more stuff in the first part that's just making a mess of things, and I have to cut half of it basically. So
nothing wrong with it being two papers.
Well, I write so slowly that two papers, that's like adding years to my life. You know, that's really, you know, there may not be enough time to write two papers. We'll have to see. Well, I'll have to think about this. I mean, so the audience issue is one that's really actually maybe the hardest question of all. And once I settle that, I'll be able to, a lot of it will fall into place. I mean, the bottom line is that neither party, the crits nor the positivists, neither one wants to read this. Neither one wants to engage with it, really. So,
I think I have a final comment on that, if I may, Alex. I'm trying to integrate everything we were talking about here about the futures of your paper. I'm thinking whether you want to first address the positivists or the crits. I don't know. I think some of you can, Michael can speak to that more, and Ben. But I'm thinking in a slightly longer time frame, what kind of strategy you want to do if you want to advance this as a project, a collaborative project with others. But I'm still thinking within political science. Is I think your best testimony will be actual empirical studies that do better than others. I mean, so this is part of what I think part of what you're doing with this entire boot camp, which is to get together some exciting research that are being motivated in some way by quantum thinking, and seeing and how they're actually producing some very innovative ways of thinking and some perhaps results that otherwise you would not get. So I think it's not so much convincing those who are already committed to positivism or critical theory, but rather building a constituency that might indeed begin with younger generations of those still in grad school, those still in training, and to really show them and to get them on board and to do projects that take on these frameworks and actually do excellent work within political scientists, that other political scientists would acknowledge, okay, this is really innovative, this is breaking the box thinking, that we actually know something more about the world today that I couldn't see from my frameworks, and to begin accumulating that evidence. I think it's going to have to be a collective testimony than a killer article per se, although that article is still necessary. You need to put that stake on the ground from which the other moves can be made. So that's how I sort of see the slightly bigger picture.
Yeah, no, I mean, I very much share that view that the key now for any kind of quantum social science is going to be publishing good articles that raise people's eyebrows and change the field in local areas one at a time, which is one reason why I had this scheme of seeding a bunch of articles by listing, here are the top 10 articles that should be written in sociology. Here are the top 10 articles that should be written in political science. So in a way, deliberately trying to do that. I mean, in terms of the empirical work, I'm not the person to do the empirical work. I don't have any empirical skills. And the paper is already too long for a journal anyway, so I probably can't add a lot empirically to this particular paper. But in the end, that's what matters is, and I think that the quantum cognition people on the psychology side have a big advantage because they've got huge data sets that they can access and use directly to model things in a quantum way. Whereas the macro social sciences, and this is what my comments and some of the other panels have been, we don't have that kind of data, those kind of data, first of all. And so it's very hard to sort of know what a quantum empirical work would look like in macro level political science or IR, for example. Although we'll see some examples on Friday of IR, quantum stuff, some of which is empirical. So it can be done. But I totally agree that it's a long-term project, and it's really about recruiting people young enough. Well, new investigators can be old too. I mean, I was a new investigator with quantum in my 40s, basically. And so I forgot where I was going with that. But yes, I think, encouraging people to write articles is the key thing. And then getting them published. That's the hard part, because, it's the reviewers who are, gatekeeping. I thought that when I got to be old, I got to become a gatekeeper, but it doesn't seem to have worked out that way. I'm still trying to get in the gate, but anyway. Is there any more? Oh, wait, we have an anonymous attendee. Isn't what Alex advocates closer to political philosophy than to political science, given its value-laden direction? Well, I guess I would want to say that we need a social science that is normatively inflected, at least. It is kind of like political philosophy, but it's meant to be scientific. And in a way, this is about what kind of social science are we trying to do? And the whole positivist, separation of subject and object and everything else that goes along with that may be science, but it's not very fruitful, perhaps, from a normative perspective. And actually, when I teach philosophy of science every other year to the graduate students, and there's growing literature now on the role of values in physical science, and not just at the front of, in terms of what things you choose to do research on and on the policy implications in the back end, but the role of values in the scientific process itself. So I'm not convinced that the distinction that the anonymous attendee is making here holds up even in the natural sciences. But that's something that would obviously be contested and have to be argued out. And then Zrinka has some empirical work. Oh, okay, that looks interesting. All right, yes, okay. Anybody else? We're at 4 o'clock. Didn't I cover everybody more or less? Oh, there's more. Okay. Anybody else? Well, this has been, I've got so many comments. I have no idea. Oh, here's the Nora Bowman article, Michael Murphy. In one of my favorite journals, Foundations of Science. There's lots of cool stuff in there. Well, should we wrap it up then? You guys did a great job. I mean, I don't even know what I'm going to do with all these comments, and a lot of good comments from the floor also. So I was hoping to crowdsource the repair of this paper, and I feel like I've managed to do that. I haven't repaired it yet, but at least I've got the crowdsourcing part. So I've got a lot of ideas, and I really appreciate all the time you put in. I know it was a lot of work. It's long paper, it's very dense. So if anybody in the audience is really, after all this, still wants to see the paper, feel free to send me an email and I'll pass it along on a case, well, not case by case basis, but there aren't that many people, so it should be okay. So, all right, well, thank you very much. And we'll see everybody, hopefully most of you anyway, tomorrow. Okay, all right.
Thank you.